This video we're going to be covering the content providers. So in this case, instead of using an already available content provider made by the Android system, we're going to be creating our own content provider. Now for this one, you'll need to download the content provider template that you will find on Canvas. This will give you the following project that has a main activity and an already made content provider. If you don't have a content provider and you're just creating it on your own app, you can simply go to File, New, Other, Content Provider. You will need to give a name for the class that is going to be implementing it and the authority URI that you're going to provide to identify the data under the content provider, effectively the database name that you want to use, or URI. Now we also have some other properties. We're going to go over them. So when you have created a content provider, you will have a Java file for the content provider, and you will have a new block added to your manifest that indicates that you have a provider implemented on this class with this URI authority. So when someone wants to access something from your content provider, they will have to access it through this authority or URI. You also have permissions. That's going to be a string that you're going to set, and if another application wants to use write or read data from your content provider, then they will need to call uses permission for this particular string in their application. If we don't have anything, then by default anyone can access it if they have the authorities. We also have exported and enabled. These are two strings that will tell Android whether your content provider is going to be available to other applications or if the system is going to be able to start the content provider independently of your application. Now the other part that you will have is the main Java activity, and then I also want the XML. So the main activity is gonna have just the following interface. You're gonna be looking at something like this in your emulator. You'll have a first name and a last name input. You're gonna have buttons for inserting and updating, for querying, for exploring the database, and for deleting. In deleting, we're gonna be deleting the current element being displayed. In updating, we're gonna be updating the element being displayed as well. So for this one, you will have a corresponding main activity.java where we're gonna be adding the functionality for all of the listeners for the buttons. We already have our find by IDs, references to every single element, and registered all of the listeners. We also have two methods that are going to be used for updating the UI. So one of them is going to be set views, is going to be updating the what we see here, and the clear is going to be making it so the UI looks like this, like it's empty everything. So now we have that, we're gonna start going through the content provider. So I've already created some very basic boilerplate code here, but we will need to implement all of these different functions for the content provider. So the first thing that we have is the name of our database. It's gonna be the names database. Then we're gonna have a main database helper, which is gonna be the object that we're gonna be using to effectively perform any operations to our database. So this one will have three methods. We're gonna have the constructor is gonna determine what context we're using, the database that we're gonna be managing. There's a factory attribute, we're not gonna be using that, and then there's the version of the database. If this version is different, then you are effectively saying that the structure of the database may be different. So if it's different, then some changes will need to be made. But for our purposes, we will just have one version of the database. We don't plan to change it. The second method is the onCreate. So when this method is called, it will execute the following query. So what's gonna happen is effectively we're gonna execute this query. This is again just a combination of UML, not UML, SQL and Java. So you're gonna be creating a table with the name of this table, and that table is gonna have three columns. So it's gonna have the ID, it's gonna be an integer, it's gonna be the primary key of the table. You're gonna have the first name, it's gonna be named like this, it's gonna be of type text, and then you're gonna have the last name of type text as well. Just keep in mind that in this case, by naming the ID underscore ID as an integer, Android will take care of adding that number whenever we're inserting into the database. It will sequentially increase that number, so we don't have to worry about tracking the IDs for our table. And that's the SQL query that is going to be called on the onCreate. So if during the constructor it notices that the database doesn't exist, then it's going to be calling onCreate, and it will create the database. Now if we had more tables, then this query will need to be longer because you will need to create other tables and so on. So those will need to happen here as well. You could split them into different SQL statements to create each table separately as well. Now we have a couple variables here. These are going to be the name of the table is going to be tables, the name of the first name column, name of the last name column. We have the authority itself. This is the URI that is going to determine the base URI of your content provider. And then you will have the content URI. In this case, it's going to be the URI that references the names table within our provider. So it's going to be content, the authority itself, so the database name, and the table name itself. We're making it as a string just because we're going to be accessing it from outside of the class. But if you're using it from a different application, then you will need to know it and write it in there. So the first thing that we're going to be doing is the query. So this one will return a cursor. Remember that a cursor is simply the object that Android Studio uses to store and show the content of a query. So here is where we're going to be starting using our helper. So we're just going to say helper dot get a readable database because we're reading from it. Then we're going to issue a query. The query is going to be asking us a couple things. So the first thing is, what table do you want to read? Well, I want to read the table names table. We don't have a projection or a selection, so we can just leave everything else null. We're just getting a read everything from query. So we could pass them all as null. But in our case, we're gonna just projection. Let's just use the ones that we're receiving. This is not going to let them be null. So non-null selection table projection selection arguments group by selection arguments. I'm gonna just use this just in case that we had an extra arguments or so. If we only want a read all, we could effectively just say null, but in this case, every single query that we're gonna be receiving or executing in our database is gonna pass through here. So if we make this, so it's just a select everything from the table, then we cannot perform a query that does any selection or projection. So that's why we're gonna need to use those. Now then we're gonna have a group by. Oops. Yeah, group by. Then we're gonna have a having attribute. We don't need that later. And then we're gonna have the order by. So that's gonna be the sort order. And that's it. So whenever we get a query, we just get the elements that we're receiving, and then you just pass it directly into our database. Now, notice here that we're not using the URI itself, just because we only have one table. If we had more than one table, then we would want to use the URI that we're receiving here. Now we can move on to update. It's gonna be actually very similar, but instead of returning a cursor, this is going to be returning an integer on how many elements were updated. Now in this one, we don't have a projection, but we do have a selection and selection arguments. And we don't have any of the other attributes. And then we need to pass in the values that we're updating to. It's gonna be an update. So we're gonna update which table, this table, what do you want to put into the table to update. These values are gonna be the update values, and then the selection and selection arguments to determine which rows in the table are going to be updated. And that's going to be returning an integer of how many rows were updated in the database. Now we can move on to delete, which is very similar, but we no longer have values. We just have a table and the selection, whatever matches that selection is going to be deleted. Now we're missing on the onCreate. We have to actually create the database and create the helper. So we're just going to create the helper here. So it's going to be the main database helper. We're gonna get the context that we need is the application context for the application, the context that we're in whenever we call the content provider. So that will take care of that. We have the query, we have the update, and we have the delete. Now we're gonna do the insert. Insert is different from the other two as it doesn't return a simple element, such as an integer or a boolean. In this case, we're gonna be returning the absolute URI to access the element that we're inserting into the database. So the first thing that we're going to be doing is very similar to what we did before. Oh, this is not a readable. It should be writable because we're writing into the database. Same thing for update. So whenever we're writing, we have to get a writable database from our helper. So we're gonna get the ID from calling the method insert. And then we can insert into the table. We don't have a column hack, and we do have the values. And then we're gonna use that ID here. So it's gonna return the URI towards that element, which is effectively the one given by this URI. So it's gonna be content authority, followed by the name of the table, followed by a path separator and the ID. This appended path is gonna be giving the URI the right separator between the table name and the ID. Now, what we might want to do, and it has to do with a little bit of security, is to do some error checking whenever you're getting data to insert into your database. Now keep in mind that you are making a content provider so that other applications may use it to read or write data into your database. So if they don't do the error checking on their side and you don't do any error checking, then you might end up with garbage data in your database that doesn't comply with the rules for your data. So in this case, what we're gonna be doing is just a very small sanity check for the values. So remember that the values are gonna be coming as a first name, as a dictionary. So all you need to get is the value the same way that you will get it from a dictionary. So the first name is gonna come with the key of first name, and we're gonna delete any trailing spaces or tabs that may come along with it. And last name, same thing. Now we can just do a small sanity check. If the last name is not an empty string, then return null. Oh, and it should be equals rather than that because we're comparing objects. And then if the first name is empty, also return null. That will effectively make it so you don't write into your database if those checks are not passed. Now, why is that? Because you're not always guaranteed, or you will not be guaranteed that whoever is using this content provider will do the correct error checking in the data beforehand. So it's just security of sorts that you will integrate in there. Now we can go and actually make use of that content provider in our application. So the first thing that we're going to be doing is the query. This is going to be the simplest one to go with. So we just want to read from the database everything that we have. So we're just going to get a cursor, which is the result. And we're going to say get a content resolver, issue query. Where do you want to do this query? So the first element is going to be the URI. So in this case, names provider, content URI. Remember that right now we're not using it, and then this is going to be a select everything from, or just fill those with null. What do I need? Projections, functions, measurements, sort, order, and that's all I need. Yeah, I just need 4 on there. Now this one, just remember the way we made it, we only have one table, so it's gonna be coming here and just using the table namespace instead of the URI, but we could effectively just pass the URI if you had more elements, but here you need to pass in URI. So we're passing the content URI, which we defined here beforehand. Now, once we have the cursor, we can actually use it to update our data. So cursor, well, let's just first check that it's not null. If it's not null, then we can actually use it. And if we have some data in our database, and we're gonna count greater than 0, then we're gonna get the first element. Move to first. And then we'll call the setViews method to update our UI. Now let me just do a small toast. And this is going to be the context, the application context. Then you just want to write how many elements there are in the database, and then show. Let's run our application. Well, let's write the insert first, so we can actually have something there. In our insert, we need two things. We need the values, which come from the first name and the last name. So we need to store that into a content values variable, which is the type of dictionary that the query is gonna ask. So the content resolver, we're gonna be inserting, which is the URI. So the same thing as before. And then what are the values that we want to insert? This. Now we need to actually put something there. So let's put, what do we want to put? Well, the key is gonna be first name, and the value is gonna be the value, then first name, text, and it's text, and it's text dot string, and then let's remove any leading or trailing spaces, tabs that may come with it. And then here, let's just change it for last name, and the same thing here. Now we can actually insert, so we can see both of those in action. So writing and reading from the database. So we inserted something, let's insert something else. Dot tabs. There we go. And our app crashed. Let's see what happened. So on click. String resource ID. Put something with the word toast. Okay, let me see. This might have something to do with this. It didn't like that I was passing an integer there. Yeah. So let's query all. As you can see, even though we deleted the application, not deleted, closed the application because of the crash, the data that we entered is still there. And as you can see, we have two elements according to the query. Now we're gonna be using these two to actually move between the elements. But if we insert another one, kilo lucky insert, on the query all, we will have 3. This is the ID that is automatically assigned. We will see how that one changes as we go along, but now we can actually move along and write the previous and the next. So for these two, we're just gonna be using the cursor. Let's first make sure that we have a cursor. So if we have not called the query, then this value is gonna be null. So we don't want to get a null pointer exception. So cursor dot Move to next. Now this will automatically move the pointer from the current cursor to the next element. Now this will return true or false. It will return true if an element was actually found and could be moved. If not, it's gonna return false. So if we couldn't move to the next, that means that we're in the last element. So let's just make it so we're moving the cursor to the first element, making it look like it's a round robin operation. We're just cycling through it. And then once we're done with that, we're just gonna update the views. Set views is rendering the current element, so we're just gonna be doing that. And then we can do the same thing for next. It's just gonna be slightly different. Because we're not gonna be moving the previous. This is going to be moved to previous, and then we're gonna move to the last element, and then this one is moved to next. So let's check that out. There we go. Let's query last element, second element, second, last to first, and we're now going through and cycling. Notice how the ID is incremented automatically. We did not say the ID for this element is 2, for this one is 3. We just simply updated it. Okay, so now we're gonna go into the last two, which are the delete and the update. So as for delete and for update, they're going to be a little bit more complicated because we actually need to make up a selection and a selection arguments for this. So the first thing that we're gonna be doing is making the selection arguments. Well, the selection clause first, and then we're gonna fill up the arguments with the data that we want to use. So this is going to be a string selection clause, and for now just make it an empty string, and then we're gonna have string array, which is going to be the selection arguments, and let's just make it an empty one for now. Then we're gonna have well deleted. It's gonna be the get content resolver dot delete. What is the URI same thing as before? Then what is the selection? Whatever we make in the selection clause, what are the arguments, whatever we put in there. Now we have to actually make this. So this is where we once again use the combination of SQL and Java. So we're gonna say that the first name equals something, and the last name equals something else. That's going to be our selection. If the name matches some element and the last name matches some element, then we're gonna be deleting that. So, or the result of that. Now, here we're gonna make the values that we're gonna use to fill of the question marks. And in this case, we're gonna be using the elements on these text views. So this is the text view that is showing the name here and the last name. So we're just gonna say, if it is something that matches this name and this last name, then delete it. So this is not set text, this is get text. dot string, let's string any content that may be redundant, and then last name dot b. Okay, that's all for delete. And then for update, we're gonna be using something very similar. So let's just copy paste this. So the selection is gonna be the same. We're gonna be updating the current element in display here, so selection doesn't change. Rows updated. And here we're gonna say update. But remember that when you're doing an update, you have to pass in some values. So in this case, we're just passing in the same values that we used on the insert. So you can simply use the same code. Right here, we need the values as the second parameter. Content values is the name. So now we're updating. Let's execute one more time our code. The elements that we added on the previous two are gonna still be there. So if you query all, and I have three elements. So now let's delete the second one. Let's query once again. We have element 1, element 3. The IDs do not get reset when you delete something. Now let's add another one. Insert, then query 1, 3, 4. Now we want to update something, then we can select it, add the new value that we want to add. We added it. Okay, go down. I did not want you to go down very fast. Come up once again. Query all. Below. Then I'm going to be updating the first one, so we'll click update. Next time we query, we just change the data for that particular element. And that's it for creating your own content provider. If you want to play more with this one, I will suggest you do a couple extra changes to this one. So for instance, you could make it to so that you only change elements based on the first name. So create a button with a query that updates only by first name, another button that queries and updates based on ID or deletes based on the ID, and that will give you a little bit more experience on working with the different queries. So you will still need to use just the elements that are here, but you will need to change the selection clauses and the selection arguments based on what you want to do. But you will not need to do any changes to the content provider itself unless you create a new table. So that's it for today, and thank you.